Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about deployment considerations of Mailbox databases. So it's really important to plan how you're going to deploy your Mailbox databases. And luckily, we've got your back, and we're going to show you some examples using the Exchange Role Calculator. That's a spreadsheet to work out a design for your environment. So in this module, we're going to cover the hardware and software requirements, and we're going to talk about performance and sizing of Exchange Server. So it's really important to know that when you do your hardware and software requirements for Exchange Server, that you refer to our course, the edX course, around the details and so on, and also use the calculator that we're going to show you later to spec out your Exchange servers that you're going to need. So in terms of the hardware requirements and software requirements for Exchange, Exchange is a very hungry application when it comes to RAM. Obviously, the more Exchange can cache in RAM, the more it can perform, the faster it will be able to serve up content from the storage system to the users. So Exchange is a 64-bit only application, and it needs a lot of RAM to cache information on that server. So hardware is important to spec out. When we say RAM, you need at least 4 gigabytes of memory, and this can go all the way up to
a minimum of 8, actually.
Sorry. But 4 gigabytes on the edge transport server, and 8 on, thank you, 8 on the server. And this goes all the way up to 96 gigabytes of RAM that you can install on Exchange Server. So if Exchange Server supports thousands of users, then you're going to need a lot of RAM on that machine. CPU-wise, the server also needs a lot of CPUs. Today, you can buy very powerful CPUs with a lot of cores and so on. So your CPUs, depending on what you calculate on your servers, will also determine how many users can you run on that server. On the storage side, there's a lot of storage options that's available to Exchange. So on the one hand, you have storage technologies like direct attached storage. So this is either disks that is inside the server as part of the server chassis, or there's a chassis hooked up to the server through a SCSI cable or something like that, and it's directly attached to the server. So this is one way of doing it. Or you can go all the way to the other side where you have fiber attached storage through a storage area network, a SAN. So all of those storage options are supported by Exchange Server. When you use,
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Given how much storage has come down in cost and increase in performance in the same time, does a company need to invest in that sort of technology and hardware these days, or could they not use what they call just a bunch of disks and get by with that?
So when you install Exchange Server and you want to, obviously all the mail is stored on disks on that Exchange Server. If you go back in history, people are paranoid about that data and about their email, and so they wanted to invest a lot of money into the storage solution, so to make sure that it's always available, it's never going to break, and so they always bought the most expensive storage solution that is available so that your precious data will never be lost. But through the innovations specifically of the database availability group that replicates databases from one server to another server, independent servers, the need for very expensive storage has diminished because you don't need to rely on the storage to secure the data. You now rely on the Exchange system and the database availability group to secure that system. So you can now do just a bunch of disks where you have the disks on one server attached to that one server, and you replicate that to other servers. And just a bunch of disks refers to a concept where you don't even use RAID. You don't set up a RAID like a mirror set of replicating one disk to another disk. You just attach one disk on that server, you make it available as a volume, and then depending on of the size of that disk, nowadays you get 8 terabyte disks. You can put multiple databases on that one disk and replicate that to other servers.
And then just leverage your high availability by relying on the Exchange native data protection features that are built into Exchange. So which even, and we'll talk about this later, I know, which even precludes the need to do backups anymore.
Yeah. So if something happens to that disk, you know, because it's a mechanical device, something can happen to that disk. It doesn't matter. If it breaks, then you just fail over to another server and you carry on working and you replace that disk whenever you have time. So that is definitely an option, and it really keeps things simple because you don't have to think about complex architectures where you have fiber channel and you have switches that you have to install to connect your servers with the storage area network. There's so many components, the fiber channel adapter in the server, the switch, the storage area network. There's so many moving parts in that solution, and that brings complexity, and that causes outages. The moment you remove complexity and you remove layers out of the system, you make it simpler and easier for it to survive any sort of failure.
Right. And I think we talk a little bit more about storage options and what to consider when we talk about performance and sizing. Something we should probably also mention is with Windows, since you have to install Exchange 2016 on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, with that operating system, now you have you can leverage the resilient file system as opposed to just using NTFS. And I understand that the resilient file system gives you, what is it, the benefits, remind me what the benefits of REFS is?
So it really gives you the ability to survive, you know, any type of, if there's a issue on that disk, like a bad cluster or something like that, it will be able to recover from those automatically, and you don't need to.
That's right. That's what it was. Now, that's not supported on the operating system volumes, but it is recommended for those partitions containing transaction logs and database files, and things like that.
So, you know, there's lots of options with storage, and we would highly recommend that people look at what is a option that makes the most sense for them that they can afford, and don't try and build in complexity into your system. Try and make it as simple as possible. In terms of the software requirements, you need to run this on Windows Server 2012. I would recommend, or Windows Server 2012 R2. My personal preference is R2 because that is the later one, and it's going to be supported for longer than the previous one. 2012 came out in 2012, and 2012 R2 came out in 2014. So obviously, the support life cycle of our operating systems are 5 years in support, and then another 5 years in extended support.
And that's the full installation. 2016 isn't supported on a server core installation.
Yeah, so server core, that installation that gives you a minimal installation that doesn't have a UI. When you log in, you only get a command prompt. That is not supported. So you need to have the full UI for Exchange servers. But luckily, in 2012, you can switch between the two. In 2008, it was a once-off decision, but in 2012, you can switch between the two.
And what are there's some prereqs that are required as well. What are some of those?
So before you install Exchange, obviously you need to install the desktop experience on that server. You need to make sure that you have the .NET framework on that server, the Windows Management Framework 4.0 as well, and the Unified Communications Managed API on that server. So those are the prereqs. And there's other prereqs as well. That's Windows features that, like IIS and so on, that it needs on that server. But you can just, there's a tick box in the setup process to say, install all the components that I need. The components that I mentioned previously is the things that you're going to need before you can install Exchange.
And then the management tools, they don't have to be installed on 2012 or 2012 R2. They can be run on Windows 10, Windows 8, and I think even Windows Server 2008 R2, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Another option is to virtualize your Exchange servers. Now, you need to be aware that Exchange doesn't know that it's virtualized. So it's not going to say, oh, I'm in a Hyper-V environment, or I'm running in this virtualized system. Now I'm going to behave differently. Exchange doesn't know that. So you need to spec your Exchange servers like you would spec a hardware for a physical machine. So if in your physical server required 32 gigabytes of RAM, then you need to spec a virtual machine with 32 gigs of RAM. Exchange don't support things like dynamic memory allocation. Dynamic memory allocation is really a concept that only works well for lab environments and so on, where you have limited resources and you wanted to run a bunch of VMs on one machine. But for Exchange, you need to have enough memory, and it needs to be real memory, because Exchange is going to use all of that memory. Other things in terms of virtualization that you need to know is your ratio of physical CPUs versus virtual CPUs shouldn't be more than 2 to 1. So if your host machine runs about or runs with 8 cores, then you cannot allocate more than 16 cores to virtual machines. Then you've gone over that ratio. So Exchange virtualization is a possibility. It's supported. But you also need to look at the products that support. So I'm not sure if every virtual platform out there is supported. We, in fact, have a program in Microsoft called the Server Virtualization Program, is VVP program, and all the virtual software that is supported by Exchange is on there. So if you're running some sort of virtual application, then you need to check that it's on the SVVP program before you can install Exchange on that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be supported. When it comes to performance and sizing, you need to do your planning. You need to know enough about your environment to spec out your Exchange servers appropriately.
Read.
Yes. So this course is a great start, but if you want to go further, then do the edX course, because we cover this in a lot more detail. You need to know, for example, how many messages do your users send and receive per day on average, because that is a transaction number that happens on the Exchange server, and you need to have hardware that can maintain that ratio of sending and receiving messages per day.
So that's the user profile?
Yes.
What they refer to as a user's profile?
The user profile, and there's a bunch of them, like low, medium.
How would you go about determining that?
So to determine that, there's a bunch of tools that you can do. Maybe you even have stats. You can say, okay, I have a mail solution that knows how many mail messages that I send and receive in one day, and then you can work out, I have so many users, I've sent and received so many messages per day, and then you do a calculation to see what happened.
I assume there's some performance counters you can use.
There's performance counters as well that you can look in your performance monitor on the Exchange server that shows you these performance counters, how many messages are that server processing at that point.
And
so
message tracking logs,
yeah,
that would be another option.
Message tracking logs. There's tools that actually imports your message tracking logs and gives you this data. So it actually calculates what is happening on that server. So that's good tools that you can run on your server to give you that information. Then once you have that information, you would go and enter this into the Exchange server role requirements calculator, and it will then give you a good idea of the server hardware that you need. Say you follow all of that guidance, you would have to then go and implement this. You go and buy your servers, or maybe if you reuse some servers, you go and purpose your servers and install Exchange on those servers. And then you need to validate that the servers that you've just installed can actually do that. And to do that, we actually provide a tool called Jetstress. And Jetstress, before even you install Exchange on that server, would validate that the storage is capable of sustaining the load that you want to put on it. So you run Jetstress at least for 2 hours. Some people prefer to run it for 24-hour cycle to sort of get the hardware burned in. And when you run Jetstress, it will give you a report at the end of the day, and it will say, okay, this was able to sustain so many IOPS. The IOPS that a disk can handle is important to note. And it will tell you that if there's any latencies when talking to the disks and so on, so it will tell you that it was able to achieve what is necessary. And also you will be able to then say, okay, I've configured my storage correctly, it's working the way it should. If you find any problems, you know, well, this hardware is supposed to do something other than what I saw now. Maybe there's something configured incorrectly in your environment. Maybe you don't have up-to-date drivers with your storage, or you didn't configure the cluster sizes correctly on your disks or something like that. And you will then see the results and you can take action. But if you just install Exchange server and Exchange is now running for a few days or a few months and then you find problems, it's really hard to then tell everybody, don't send any mail. I'm first going to do a Jetstress to see if there's any problems. So it's really important that you do this first.
This sounds like a really, really important topic, and one that people really need to understand when they plan their deployment. I imagine that there's a lot more detail we're not discussing that would be in the edX course, is that correct?
Yeah, so the edX course shares tips and also shows you some of the things that you need to look out for in terms of how do you configure Jetstress and so on when you want to run this tool. So definitely check that out. So I think because I've talked about it so much, I want to give people a demo on the Exchange role calculator. And let's look at this calculator. So this is a calculator that you can download from Microsoft. There's a link in the calculator actually that you can check that you have the latest version. And so it's always important that you have the latest version, because sometimes we do find that in a subsequent update of Exchange that we've improved performance, so we need to make a change in this calculator, or we found a bug in the calculator and we need to fix that. So it's important that you always use the latest one. The information that you input in this calculator is critical, because if you enter junk in this calculator, and if
you get junk back,
you get junk back. Yes. If you just guess what is your profile, and it's going to tell you what you told it your profile is, and it's going to then make sure that, or give you information that's not useful. So do your homework to make sure that that is the right thing, and it does reflect your environment. This calculator supports Exchange 2013 as well as Exchange 2016. So that's the very first question that it asks you is what version of Exchange are you going to implement? Are you going to implement 2013 or 2016? So if you change this to 2013, I just want to briefly show you, then you immediately have an option where you split mailbox and client access server roles. But if you go back to 2016, that option disappears and you can no longer configure that option. Then you have your global catalog architecture, whether that's 64-bit or 32-bit. In most cases, it's 64-bit. The defaults is pretty good.
When would it be 32-bit?
So if you run 2013 and you still have 2003 domain controllers that are global catalogs, then that would be 32-bit. So in terms of virtualization, you can tell this calculator that you're going to do virtualization, and it will give you extra information about virtualization. And then you can say, I want to do a high availability deployment, or this is going to be a single server deployment. Most of the cases, obviously, we recommend that you do a high availability deployment. And then the next thing that you say, and you see if you hover over any field here, it gives you a very detailed description of what that field means. So I want to say how many mailbox servers is going to be in the primary data center. So I'm going to just, for fun, make this 4. And then you can say how many database availability groups are you going to have. And so this is 10. I'm going to just make this 1. So now I have 1 DAG with 4 servers in it. You can then decide how you're going to break up this information. So the number of databases that will have active copies, I'm going to say there's 3 of them. The number of databases that's going to be lagged. A lagged database is a database that hasn't applied all the transaction logs to it, so it's behind in time. And these reasons why you sometimes create lagged databases, which we'll talk about later. And then you can also say how many high availability copies is available in the second data center. So if I have a secondary data center, then I can configure that as well. And then how many lag copies will I have in the secondary data center? So if I say, for example, I'm not going to have any lag copies in my primary data center, then you immediately see here that it does not have enough servers to do the configuration here, and it highlights that in yellow to say you need to change something here to make sure that you have enough copies and so on. So let's change this back to 1 lag copy. There's some other configurations here. Most of the defaults here is fine, but you can, if you know more about your environment, then you can add that. A data overhead factor. Sometimes if you know something special about your databases and so on that happens in your environment, you can add a percentage here to say, I want to add another overhead, like an extra fluff almost, to my databases, just to be sure that I'm not going to run out of space. You can also then say how many mailbox moves are happening per week. So 1% of my mailboxes, I think I'm going to move per week. Also, am I going to have a dedicated maintenance store? So this is where, say I need to do a recovery or I need to mount a database quickly. Will I have any of those? Then how much free storage do I want on a disk? So this is, again, extra breathing room that you want to keep on that disk. This is low because if you think about it, on an 8 terabyte disk, if you go to, usually in the past we set 20% free space on a volume. On 8 terabyte disk, that is 1.6 terabyte of space that you're never going to use, that you sort of just keep in reserve. For some people, that might sound like a good idea, but it's a lot of space. So over time, the recommendation came down from 20% to 5%. And, in 5%, that is 500 gigabytes of space on an 8 terabyte disk. You can also say whether or not you will have lock shipping network compression enabled. That is enabled by default. And what's the percentage that compression will happen. So this is just a good average that you can use. Also, you can add I/O overhead factors. We recommend that you use 20%. So this is the transactions that happens on the disks. If it's 20% is a good recommendation, but you can add additional overhead as well. So for example, if you use certain mobile phones have a component that runs inside of your network that pulls the mailboxes, that puts extra overhead on the servers, and that can cause extra I/O on the server. So that is basically the top of the server. Then you have the different tiers. You can have up to 4 tiers that you enter into the server. You have, this is where you give information about your user. So I'm going to say I have 1,000 users. That's this tier. You say how many, what's the growth rate? you can say this will grow with 0% per year, or if you're growing your organization, you may want to change this. This is where you specify your profile. You can make this smaller. So if they receive less messages per day, 50 messages per day, you make it 50. Or if they receive a lot, you can make this 500 messages a day. And that's a lot of emails that people send and receive in a day. You also enter information about your average message size, and then the mailbox size that you want to give people. You can say, I want to give my users a 2 GB mailbox each. And then what is the mailbox size? Sorry, the initial mailbox is what the initial size will be. So it will start with that size. And then what is the max? A 10 GB mailbox. So you can change all of these settings, deleted item retention, and so on. And you do this for all 4 profiles. So some users, you may have 1,000 users that send and receive 200 messages a day. And then you may have a bunch of users, let's make them 500 users, and they receive a lot of messages per day. So you see how you configure different profiles.
I'd imagine it'd be different for like your upper management, VIPs. Yes.
Yeah. Then you say, you give your backup requirements. You say, I want to use native data protection, or you can say, I'm going to use hardware solution or software VSS solution. And then you can also say, if possible, give me a JBOD solution. And depending on how you set up your DAG, you may not be able to set up a JBOD solution, because with JBOD, we recommend that you have at least 3 database copies. And then we also say, if possible, put multiple databases on a volume. And then we can say, what is the number of databases that matches the count as well. And then we can say, automatically required the Exchange database volumes that is required, and if we want the auto reseed volume as well. Here we specify the disks that we're going to use. So if you want to buy 12 terabyte disks or 8 terabyte disks, you select them here, and you decide what disks are you going to use for your operating system, for your databases and logs, and for your restore volume. And then for your second data center, you can have a different type of disk system. Then finally, you also specify the CPUs that your servers will have. It's got 16 cores, and the core capacity, the spec int value. And so you get this from this website, the spec workshop website that tells you what the server can do. And then you enter your replication requirements. So you can look at the log files on an existing server if you run servers. How many log files are generated in 24 hours? So you can just do a simple query to see in hour 0 to 1, there is 50 log files, and in hours 2, there were so many log files, and you then do some sort of division between over 24 hours, and you work out the ratio. Maybe during the day, you generate a lot more log files, so the percentages in this columns during the day is going to be higher, and then at night it's going to be lower. And you enter that information. And then finally, you give some Exchange server names that you're going to enter of your Exchange servers. And then once you've entered all of that information, it gives you the results. And it tells you how many how big the databases will be on the server, and how, let me just zoom in here so that we can show this. So there's a lot of that shows you what's the RAM requirements of the server, what's the storage architecture you can use, how many, what's the CPU utilization. Because I didn't enter a spec int value, it's not showing me that currently. It gives you activation scenarios. So if you fail over the servers, what's going to happen on the server. And the neatest thing to me about this calculator is this distribution tab. The distribution tab shows you almost a graphical figure of how you should configure your server. So I have 4 servers in my primary data center, and I have 4 servers in my secondary data center, and it shows me where the databases will be. So the 1 is the active database, and the 2 is the passive databases, and it shows you how it's spread out through your organization. And if you click on a server, it will show you how that database fails over to other databases. And then the best thing about this tab is it gives you this button, which allows you to export all your information that you've just entered into deployment scripts. And if I export this to my desktop, it now created Exchange scripts that shows me exactly what databases needs to be created and so on. So this contains a script that I can use to deploy Exchange in my environment.
Oh, that's neat.
So very, very useful tool that helps you to run and plan your Exchange environment and make sure that you have the right deployment. So that wraps up our session on Exchange database deployment. The key takeaway here is plan, plan, plan. Always make sure that you plan your environment, use the storage calculator, validate your installation using tools like Jetstress, and stay tuned for more information on Exchange Server Mailbox Databases.